My son-in-law left his laptop open on my kitchen table. He'd been staying with me for 3 days by then, him and my daughter both, while their apartment was being repainted. That's what they told me anyway. I didn't question it. I was glad to have the company. The house had been quiet since Dorothy passed, 14 months before that Tuesday morning, and quiet has a way of turning into something heavier than you expect. I came downstairs early, 6:15, maybe 6:20. I'd slept poorly. The laptop was sitting there on the table next to a coffee mug he'd left out, the screen still glowing. I wasn't going to look at it. I poured myself a cup of coffee, stood by the window, watched a robin work at the ground near the fence. Dorothy used to keep a bird feeder right there. I kept meaning to refill it. I turned around to set my mug in the sink, and that's when I saw it. Not because I was snooping, because the screen was facing me and the text was large and the subject line was visible from across the room. Rah! Dad's property situation, next steps. I stood there for a moment. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe his own father. Maybe a work thing. But my daughter is an only child, and her husband's father passed years ago. There was only one person, Dad, referred to in that household. I sat down at the table. I'm not proud of what I did next. I am also not ashamed of it. The email chain went back 11 days. It started with my son-in-law. I'll call him by what I've called him for 9 years, which is nothing flattering in my head, though his given name is Spencer. Writing to my daughter. The subject line began there as, "Talk to Craig. He thinks we have options." Craig, I'd find out later, was a friend of Spencer's from his MBA program who had gone into estate law. I read the whole thread. It took me about 8 minutes. My coffee went cold. Here is what I learned in those 8 minutes. Spencer had been telling people, my daughter included, though she was more a participant than an instigator, I think, or I hope, that I was showing signs of cognitive decline, that I'd been forgetting things and making poor financial decisions. He'd apparently mentioned this to Craig, who had outlined, in a subsequent email that Spencer forwarded to my daughter, the process by which an adult child could petition for limited guardianship over a parent's finances in the state of Ohio. The house I live in has been in my family for 22 years. Dorothy and I bought it in 2003 for $214,000. The county appraised it last year at $490,000. The neighborhood had grown up around us, good school district, close to the new hospital, a park 2 blocks over that we used to walk to on Sunday mornings. The house wasn't just an asset. It was the place where we raised our daughter, where Dorothy kept her garden, where I still have a workshop in the basement with tools I've had since I was 30 years old. Spencer's email to my daughter said, if we can establish conservatorship, we control decisions about the house. The rental income alone would cover what we owe. They were $67,000 in debt. I didn't know that until I read that email. I'd known things were tight for them. Spencer had been between jobs for 7 months, 2 years ago, and my daughter had taken a pay cut when her company downsized. But $67,000, credit cards, a personal loan, a second one they'd taken out to pay off the first. I read the email twice. Then I closed the laptop exactly the way I'd found it, picked up my coffee, walked to the sink, poured it out, and went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the wall for a while. Dorothy's reading glasses were still on the nightstand. I hadn't moved them. I looked at those instead. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it wasn't what you might expect. There was no wave of rage, no impulse to go down there and throw them both out. What I felt, sitting on that bed, was something closer to a slow recognition, like when you've been misreading a word for years and suddenly you see it correctly and you can't unsee it. I thought about the last 6 months. All the small things. Spencer suggesting I might want to think about a smaller place. My daughter asking very gently whether I'd ever considered just talking to someone about how I was managing since Dorothy. The way they'd both been extra attentive lately. Calls I hadn't asked for, Spencer offering to help me organize my finances. I had taken all of it as kindness. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer. I designed drainage systems for municipalities across 3 states. I am not, by any measure I know of, showing signs of cognitive decline. I still do the crossword in pen. I balance my own accounts. I'd never once missed a bill payment. But I also know that cognitive decline doesn't need to be true to be alleged. It just needs to be alleged convincingly, and to the right people. I didn't say a word to either of them at breakfast. Spencer made eggs. My daughter made small talk about a show they were watching. I nodded in the right places. I asked about their drive over, how the painting at the apartment was coming. Normal things. I've never been a dramatic man, and I wasn't going to start that morning. They left around 9 to go to the apartment and check on the painters. I watched their car pull out of the driveway. Then I went to the kitchen table and sat back down where Spencer's laptop had been. And I thought about what I was going to do. The first call I made was to a friend of mine, a man I'd known since my early 40s who had retired from practicing family law the previous year. I told him what I'd read. He listened without interrupting, which is something I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he said, "Okay, here's what you need to know." What I needed to know was this: in Ohio, adult guardianship over a living person's finances, called a limited conservatorship in some contexts, requires a court process. It requires medical evidence. It requires a hearing. It is not something that can be done quietly or quickly, and it is absolutely not guaranteed. A petition can be filed, but a competent adult has every right to contest it, and contesting it with a clean bill of health and clear financial records is, in most cases, sufficient to defeat it. He also told me something else. He said, the best way to make this impossible is to make the asset unavailable. I asked him what he meant. He said, you can't petition for guardianship over something that no longer belongs to you. I drove to his house that afternoon. We talked for 2 hours. I took notes on a legal pad like I was back in a project meeting, which I suppose in a way I was. By the time I left, I had a plan. It was not a complicated plan, but it was a careful one. Here is what I did, and in roughly the order I did it. First, I called a real estate attorney, a different one, someone I found through my accountant, and asked for a consultation on selling my home, not listing it, selling it directly, off-market. My accountant had mentioned years ago that there were investment groups that bought residential properties in cash, quickly, for owners who wanted a clean exit without the theatre of a traditional sale. I'd filed that away. I'm an engineer. I file things away. The attorney connected me with 2 such groups. The first one made a preliminary offer of $430,000, too low. The second came in at $468,000, sight unseen, pending a walkthrough. We did the walkthrough on a Wednesday. By Friday, they'd come up to $475,000, cash, 30-day close as is. That was not $490,000. But $490,000 was a county appraisal, not a guaranteed sale price. And $475,000 in 30 days, without an agent's commission, without staging, without 6 months of showings and strangers walking through Dorothy's garden, was something I could accept. I accepted it. Second, I called my financial advisor and told him I was going to be receiving a significant sum and I needed to discuss restructuring. We met for 90 minutes. I'm not going to detail every decision I made there because some of it is still in process, but I will say that a meaningful portion of what I received from the sale went into a vehicle that is not easily accessible by a third party, regardless of what any court might or might not someday say. Third, and this one gave me some particular satisfaction. I called the credit union that held a $22,000 personal loan on which I had, at Spencer's request 2 years prior, agreed to be a co-signer. I told them I wanted to remove myself as co-signer. They told me I couldn't remove myself from an existing loan, which I already knew, but that I could notify them formally that I was withdrawing any informal assurances I had given and that any future communications about the account should not involve me. I did this in writing. It meant that when that loan came up for any kind of renewal or modification, I would have no involvement. It also meant Spencer would know I had done it when the time came. Fourth, I found a small apartment. Not assisted living. Not a retirement community. An apartment on the 4th floor of a building 12 miles from the house, in a neighborhood with a good coffee shop on the corner and a hardware store 2 blocks away. 2 bedrooms. One for me. One that would eventually be my workshop. Month-to-month lease. The closing on the house happened on a Thursday. Spencer and my daughter were in Chicago that week for a work conference. Spencer had started a new job, and this was some kind of onboarding event. I had known about the trip for 3 weeks. It had, in fact, been one of the reasons I pushed for a 30-day close rather than the more typical 45. When they left on Monday morning, I had 11 days. I want to say something here about the house itself, because I don't want this to sound like it was easy. It wasn't. Dorothy picked the tile in the front bathroom. It took her 3 weekends of looking at samples. She said the color reminded her of the ocean in the early morning before the sun was fully up. I don't know if that's how I would have described it, but she was right that it was beautiful. The kitchen was the room I'd spent the most hours in over the last 14 months. Not cooking, mostly, but sitting. The window there faces east, and in the morning the light comes through in a particular way that made it bearable to be alone. I loaded the moving truck myself, with 2 men I hired from a local service. It took 6 hours. I left some things, a bookshelf I'd built badly, some furniture that had seen better days, the dining table that had always wobbled on the left side, no matter what I did to the legs. The new owners would deal with it or they wouldn't. That wasn't my concern anymore. There were 2 things I did not leave. One was the small camera I had installed in the front hallway the week before closing. It was a model I'd seen advertised, wireless, about the size of a matchbox, that connected to an app on my phone. I installed it inside a decorative clock that had hung in the hallway for 15 years. The clock still worked. The camera faced the front door. The other was the letter. I wrote the letter over the course of 3 evenings. I wrote it the way I used to write technical reports, clearly without unnecessary words, with every important piece of information in the right order. I told my daughter and Spencer what I had read on that laptop. I told them what I had done in response. I told them that the house had been sold, that my finances were restructured, and that the guardianship option they had been discussing was no longer viable and would not become viable. I told Spencer specifically that I had withdrawn from the cosign on his loan and that he should plan accordingly. I also wrote something else at the end that I will not repeat here exactly because it was meant for my daughter and not for anyone else. But the short version is this. I told her that I loved her, that I had always loved her, and that I didn't entirely blame her for what had been planned, though I wasn't yet sure what to do with the fact that she had let it go as far as it had. I told her that the door between us was not closed, but that it was no longer the door she thought it was, and she was going to have to decide what to do with that. I left the letter on the kitchen counter, in a white envelope with both their names on it. Then I drove away. That was a Thursday. Spencer and my daughter were scheduled to return on Sunday. I know this because I was tracking their itinerary, not by any covert means, but because my daughter had sent it to me as a matter of habit before any trip, ever since she was in college. Old patterns die hard. Sunday came. I was in my apartment, which still smelled like paint and cardboard boxes and, faintly, the hardware store bag of drawer organizers I'd bought the day before. I was making coffee. My phone buzzed. I looked at the camera app. They were standing at the front door. Spencer had his key out. He put it in the lock. He tried to turn it. He tried again. He looked at my daughter. He tried a 3rd time. The locks had been changed as part of the closing process. The new owners, a property investment company LLC, no personal faces attached, had rekeyed all the locks the morning after the close. Spencer stepped back from the door. I watched him on the small screen of my phone while my coffee finished brewing. He said something to my daughter. She put her hand over her mouth. He tried the key one more time. Then he looked up at the front of the house. I don't know what he was looking for. Something that would make sense of it, maybe. Something that would explain how this could have happened without them knowing. It had happened because I hadn't said a word. Not since that Tuesday morning when I read his email and closed the laptop and walked to the sink and poured out my cold coffee. For 34 days I had carried this and managed it and said nothing. And now there was nothing left to say. My daughter called me 20 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I let that go too. I poured my coffee, found a chair that was angled toward the window, and sat down. She left a message on the third call. I listened to it later that evening, after I'd had time to eat something and sit with the quiet for a while. Her voice in the message was somewhere between confused and frightened. She said, "Dad, please call me. Something happened. I don't understand. I understand. I understood that was the difference between us." Spencer never called. I didn't expect him to. I called my daughter back the following morning. It was a long conversation, and it was painful in the way that necessary things are sometimes painful, and I will not recount all of it here. She cried. I did not, though not because I wasn't moved. I was moved. I just had nothing left in me that wanted to come out that way. What I told her was simple. I had seen the email chain. I had protected myself in the only way that made sense. I was not in cognitive decline. I was not slowing down. I was a 67-year-old man who had just completed a real estate transaction and a financial restructuring in 30 days, from scratch in secret, while hosting them for dinner twice a week. If that was slowing down, she should have high hopes for me. She said she was sorry. I believed her mostly. I told her that sorry was a place to start, not a place to finish, and that I would need time to understand my own mind about everything before I knew what came next for us. She asked where I was living. I gave her the address. She asked if she could come. I said, not yet. That was 4 months ago. We've spoken many times since then. The conversations have gotten, I think, a little easier. She has not spoken Spencer's name in our calls for the last 6 weeks, which tells me something about the state of their situation that she hasn't said directly. I have not asked. I have my workshop mostly set up. The second bedroom is tight but functional. I have a coffee maker I like and a window that gets morning light and a hardware store 2 blocks away. Last week I drove past the old house. Not intentionally. I took a wrong turn. The bird feeder in the backyard is gone, which makes sense. The new owners wouldn't have known about it. I thought about Dorothy and about the Tuesday morning when I came downstairs early and poured a cup of coffee and watched a robin work at the ground where the feeder used to be. And I thought about all the things that were already gone before I even read that email. I am 67 years old. I built drainage systems for 31 years, and then I sat quietly in a kitchen with morning light coming through the window, and I raised my daughter mostly right and loved my wife completely, and then watched everything get rearranged by someone who looked at a $490,000 appraisal and saw only a number and an opportunity. I finished my coffee. I went home. I've had 4 months now to sit with all of it. Not to be angry, the anger was never really the point, but to actually understand what happened, and why, and what it means about the choices I made along the way, including the ones that led to that Tuesday morning in the first place, is what I keep coming back to. Spencer didn't appear out of nowhere. I let him in. I co-signed his loan. I welcomed him into my home for a week while they waited on the painters. I interpreted every red flag as something else, as affection, as concern, as the natural awkwardness of a man who had never quite figured out how to talk to his father-in-law. I was generous with my interpretations because I am, by nature and by choice, a generous person. That's not a flaw. But generosity without discernment is just another word for being easy to take advantage of. The people who move against you quietly are counting on exactly that. They're counting on you to fill in the blanks with the best possible version of their intentions. Spencer counted on it for months, maybe longer, and the uncomfortable truth is that it almost worked. Not because I'm naive, but because I trusted the structure of the relationship more than I watched the behavior inside it. What changed everything wasn't rage. It was clarity. The moment I read that email chain, I didn't fall apart. I closed the laptop, poured out my coffee, and went upstairs to think. That's not coldness. That's what happens when you've spent 31 years solving problems that don't care about your feelings. You learn to separate what you feel from what you need to do next. That skill, built over decades of unglamorous professional work, turned out to be the most important thing I had in that moment. More important than the house. More important than the money. I want to say something about what I think character actually is, because I've thought about it a lot since this happened. It's not what you do when things are going well. It's what you do in the 34 days after you find out that people you trusted were quietly building a case to take control of your life. Do you blow it up immediately, out of hurt and pride? Or do you get quiet, get organized, get legal advice, make careful decisions, and let the outcome speak for itself? Spencer came home to a house with changed locks. I didn't put him there with a confrontation. He put himself there with a plan. I simply declined to be the victim of it. My daughter is a different case, and I think about her differently. She made a choice to go along with something she knew was wrong, and I think she knew it was wrong, and I think that knowledge is part of what she's been sitting with since Sunday. I'm not done with her, but I am done pretending that love is a reason to stop paying attention. Dorothy would have read that laptop too. She was sharper than me in most of the ways that mattered. I think she would have handled it faster and with considerably less sentiment. I think she would have had coffee waiting when I came back from my attorney friend's house that afternoon. And she would have said something practical and a little dry. And we would have moved forward together. I didn't have that. I had a quiet house and a legal pad and 31 years of knowing how to build something that doesn't fail under pressure. That turned out to be enough.